Maybe I'll just give an intro while we're reading. Why this topic in general. Yeah, so essentially in my last job at Bubble, and also before when I worked for DogBuddy, the startup, I worked a lot with A/B tests. So especially at Bubble, it was pretty much the core of my work was to build this kind of experimentation platform and to industrialize experimentation, let's say. So yeah, this is a topic that's super interesting to me. And this talk in particular, I started giving it at IRL last year. So I've been invited as a guest lecturer since I came to Berlin, I guess. IRL is this bootcamp that runs in different cities, and yeah, they have this data analytics bootcamp specifically, and they cover some statistics topics. So they said, oh, it would be interesting to learn a little bit more about A/B testing. So at first I did this presentation as it was actually not this presentation, it was something different. It was like a workshop on how to do A/B tests, but it didn't, it was kind of like a repetition of what the students had already learned in class. So it wasn't as exciting. So I thought, let's talk about things that go wrong in A/B tests and how are actually A/B tests set up in a digital product, which many of the students don't really have any real exposure to unless they've worked in that kind of industry before. So this is how the stock came up. And I've adjusted it for us, but some of the content I'll kind of skip through because, all of us work in digital products, so we more or less know or could imagine how an A/B test would be set up, for example, from a technological point of view. But yeah, some of the other parts of how to design and how to analyze experiments and how to avoid pitfalls are also valuable for us, I think, as well. So if everybody's here,
yeah, let's do it.
We could start? Okay, I'll put in presentation mode. I could still see the people in the bottom. Okay. All right, well, let me know if, just stop me if I go too fast or something. So, right, we're going to talk about tackling issues with A/B tests in real life. And I guess this session has some key learning outcomes. So the idea is that we'll all understand how experiments are usually set up. Again, I'll go more quickly through this part. Then we'll be able to identify issues with experiment design and know some ways to solve them. Also, I'll talk briefly about how to design experiments when we have little traffic for so small sample sizes. Then we'll identify some issues with experiment implementation and also analysis, but also know how to detect them and what problems they might cause for the result. And kind of an overarching theme is how to not be tricked by probability when analyzing the results of your data. Yeah, so I used to do these trainings for non-technical folk, and I felt like it was always interesting to have this little primer in the beginning of why do we actually care to do A/B tests instead of just releasing a feature and seeing how it, what happens. And perhaps this is a nice visual representation of this is what we kind of expect when we go into that thinking. We expect that the metric of interest is kind of flat over time. And then we will release some feature and we will see this very obvious step change. And this step change will be so obvious that we'll be able to detect it even visually, by visually inspecting our data. But the maybe sad reality is that metrics and data is not flat, and it has all kinds of influences, both from inside and outside. So, for example, here, this metric has a lot of seasonality. It's a yearly seasonality. So, January is very low, but then it picks up and then it drops again in the summer. It can have weekday seasonality. So, and of course, it could have external effects such as, the COVID effect. When people started staying at home, a lot of metrics just behaved completely unpredictably. So a lot of, metric prediction models just didn't really work anymore because it was completely outside of the patterns that it's seen before. So really, A/B tests are powerful because they're able to isolate simply the effect of your feature, of this one change that you implemented, from any other external factor. Okay, so first, just how A/B tests are usually run, at least in my experience. Usually you'd start with some kind of user problem or opportunity. I guess that could come from qualitative sources or user surveys, I don't know, UX research, etc. And then some group of experts, let's say, would come up with some possible solutions for this one user problem that we identified as very important and we want to solve. Each of these possible solutions could be mapped to an A/B test, or an A/B test could be designed to validate whether this possible solution is actually good to solve this problem. So when we design this A/B test, we can come up with the UI design, the blueprint or wireframe of how this change should work. Then we also need to create the experiment design, which I'll show you in a second. It's just kind of a table or a list of things we need to consider. We, of course, need to make sure that we have tracking in place to know the metric that we're interested in. And finally, of course, we need to implement it in code. And then we run the A/B test, we evaluate the results, and we say, could we maybe iterate actually on this possible solution that we came up with? And after some iterations, perhaps we say that, oh, yes, we managed to, this solution that we experimented with was good, and it did tackle the original problem that we set out to solve, so it's good. Or otherwise, maybe we don't ever see, after multiple iterations, any effect. So we say, okay, this possible solution did not really solve the problem that we tried to address. So we move on to another possible solution. So this is kind of, in an ideal world, the life cycle of A/B testing. Just UI designs, right? You need to have some kind of idea of what is it, this change that you're trying to implement, what does it actually look like for the user? And that's important because it will also inform the tracking that we want to implement. It also helps us understand, so not just the person who designed the idea or the solution, but also the person who will design the experiment, if they're different. It helps create some, common ground of what is it exactly that we are trying, what behavior we're really trying to analyze. Then we really need to have this experiment design. So usually it helps very much to have this kind of document where everybody's aligned on what is this experiment trying to prove. So we have this experiment hypothesis, which, for example, this kind of corresponds to this GIF from before of introducing some new payment methods, for example. So we could say an experiment hypothesis could be, for example, showing users the option to pay with this new payment provider will increase the conversion rate from the payment page to payment by 10%. Now, you might notice this is not actually an experiment hypothesis as it would be written in a scientific context, but it is what helps people communicate about the purpose of the experiment. It also contains some other information, such as what is the metric that we're interested in, so the conversion rate from payment page to payment. It tells us which actions we need to track, so payment page, the actual payment, and very importantly, it includes a hypothesized effect size. So this is the idea that we start off the experiment by, or before the experiment, we already make a bet about how big is the effect going to be of this change. And we'll see in a second why this is important. We also need to define what are the variants that we have in our experiment. For example, if we simply have two variants, control and test, we can say 50-50 split, for example, as the most typical and the one that leads to the fastest result. Then we can say which users in particular are being targeted by this experiment. Oftentimes, I guess when we have little data, perhaps we want to just target all users at once, but sometimes we have specific hypotheses about some specific segment of users, such as only power users or only new users, for example. And then it actually also narrows down to the specifics of this implementation. the devices, for example, maybe this payment method is only available for Android, only in specific countries, etc. And this is important because it helps us understand what is the number of users that we can possibly target, but also whether our results are actually generalizable to other populations after we compute the data. One interesting point that I never thought would be important, but actually is this concept of an experiment exposure. So where will exactly the experiment be placed? So when is the first point in the user timeline inside your application that they will actually see any different? And that specific point in time is quite important because it's essentially the denominator of any kind of ratios, for example, that we're computing afterwards. So effectively, when is a user receiving the treatment? And then, as we said before, we need to know the key decision metric. So what is the metric that will tell us if the experiment was good or not, or the solution was good or not? We need to know the baseline, which of course we can go to our past data and calculate it. We need to make a hypothesized desired effect size, which is plugged into different calculations later on. And then with all of these ingredients, we can also make an approximate estimation of the duration of the experiment. If you say that we need, for example, this many observations to reach, to detect this kind of effect size, based on our current traffic, it would take us 2 weeks, for example. We'll look into this in a second in more detail. Then, of course, we need to, actually make sure that we're tracking the data correctly. And perhaps we need to add special events, for example, for this experiment, such as if we're placing the experiment here on the payment page where we show the OXO provider, for example, we need to create some kind of event that says experiment triggered, which is going to contain not only the information that the user saw that payment page, but also information about which group were they in, so that we can tell whether they're control or test, for example, and also whether they were actually eligible for the experiment, assuming that we are targeting a subsection, for example. So here's just an example. We can have, an example exposure event could be like experiment started or triggered. This is a user, when it happened. This is the experiment that the user is in, because we could have multiple experiments for the same user and even on the same page. And then which variant was the user in, and then some other information. So this we can later on connect with our conversion event. So payment success, for example. So we can see how much did the user spend, and in fact, did they spend, right? Etc. So finally, after you have all of these ingredients, you need to actually implement the experiment in the code. An example setup, typically a user goes to the page where they're supposed to be treated with this experiment variant. And then we would usually make some kind of determination of which group the user should be in. This might sound trivial, maybe we think, oh, maybe every second user will put into test or control, but there are certain considerations, such as each user should always be in the same variant. So it cannot be that when the user comes in today, they are in the test group, and when they come in tomorrow, they're in the control group. We also should be careful that we don't introduce some kind of biases in how we assign users into different groups. It's supposed to be completely randomized. That's why it's called a randomized controlled experiment. So usually we'd use some kind of external splitter, which is essentially just a, random.choice function that tells us that this user will be in control, this user will be in test with these probabilities. And then based on this assignment that we receive, we direct the user into either the test variation or the control variation, and then either of those could convert or not convert. This topic of splitting comes up a lot. And we'll talk about this a bit in analyzing experiments afterwards. But this was basically, the quick intro to how, at least in my experience, experiments are usually set up. Now to the juicy stuff. So some common issues in setup. I actually have in these slides, I have a lot more content, so I'll share it afterwards if you're curious, but I chose just some bits that are perhaps more interesting for us. So one common issue or misconception is this idea of basically what kind of question can you answer with an A/B test? So can we actually test whether a user doing some action makes the user do more of something else? So this is an example of Udacity. So when I signed up for a course in Udacity, it gives me this option to create a calendar reminder. I think it just sends me an SMS or an email or something like that. So I choose which days I want to study, for how long, etc. So one could be tempted to make this hypothesis to say users who set up a reminder to learn return to Udacity more often. But although this is a very interesting question, generally speaking, kind of a research question, it is not very well formulated for an A/B test. And this is because, maybe I'll go here. This is because the user actually has a choice of whether to take the treatment or not. When you go to Udacity and it offers you to set a reminder, you have the option of not setting a reminder, which means that by conditioning on the users who only set a reminder or didn't, we're also conditioning on some other underlying and perhaps latent or unmeasurable quality of these users, such as their motivation to learn. So perhaps people who are intrinsically more motivated to learn will choose to set a reminder, and therefore they will be coming back more often. But the actual cause of it is not the fact that they set a reminder, but the fact, or this kind of unmeasurable intrinsic motivation to learn. And this we can never measure, this we don't have really data on. So we cannot really formulate an experimental hypothesis like that. Although again, it's a very interesting research question in general. So perhaps we could reformulate this to say, to set it into terms of something that we can control. The same way as an experiment needs to be randomized, it's also controlled. And controlled means that we control the allocation of the treatment, right? So offering users the option to set a reminder will increase their return rate is perhaps a more valid hypothesis that we can set, because we can control whether we offer users or not this option. So on one hand, we perhaps, let's say in the test variant, we show the users the option to set a reminder, and in the control variant, we do not show them the option. And then in both groups, we will have the same proportion of users because they're randomly split, right? We will have the same proportion of users who are highly motivated and not motivated. So their motivation distribution, which we cannot measure, is assumed to be equal in the two groups. Therefore, what we are measuring is the impact that offering this option will have on their return rate. So effectively, this removes what we call the self-selection bias, which is quite important. And in clinical settings, they even have pretty complex kind of remedies for this, because even if you give somebody a drug to take, unless it's like an injection that they have to receive at the laboratory, there's this compliance rate, right? So you give somebody a heart medicine to take, whether it's placebo or a real one, and they still have to actually take it when they go home. So you have to actually measure that, did they take it, and kind of adjust for it. But this is going into very kind of much more advanced, statistics territory. Yes?
Isn't that two different relationships? Like one is the conversion of the feature once you enter it, and the other one is the conversion of people using the feature. But both are valuable to look at. So one is like, do people comply based on how we present it?
Yeah.
And the other one is, if they comply, what is the effect?
Yes, exactly. So there are two steps essentially, but one of them has a certain self-selection bias in it. So if we want to kind of get rid of that bias, we can just say, we can take it from the earlier stage. So take the very step 0 to step whatever last one.
Mm-hmm.
And then the results, although they're a little bit more watered down, that's true, because your denominator is higher, the results are valid. Whereas in the other case, you need to be very careful of how you analyze the data.
I see.
Okay, so I had this little exercise maybe. Don't know if it's of interest, but basically to see whether some of these hypotheses are good or not for an A/B test specifically, right? Not just for any research. So the exercise is to determine if the following experiment hypotheses are possible to test in an A/B testing scenario, given what you know about how LinkedIn works. So this is not for Adrian, but or Robbie. But yeah, seeing, yeah, I don't know, maybe you can give me some ideas. So yeah, users who send more requests are more likely to return to LinkedIn the next day. Is it a hypothesis that's testable in an A/B test?
My intuition would be to say no, because we don't really control how much requests is sent somehow.
Yeah, exactly. So this is, of course, a very interesting research question that could be analyzed with different techniques, but for an A/B test, this would be pretty hard for us to actually find out.
So why exactly is that? I didn't like, for example, if you say you implement a feature to encourage people more prominently to send out requests, or like make it super easy.
Yeah, what you're
Like
saying?
how like you would. I'm not 100% sure how that will prevent you from testing that.
No, so what you said makes for an excellent hypothesis, A/B test
Okay.
hypothesis.
So
Yeah,
like your
it's
point
just
is that you shouldn't skip that step, right? The hypothesis is people who receive prompts to send out requests and do that are more likely to return on the next day.
exactly. Now we can see whether showing this prompt makes people send more requests, for example, but that's another question. If we're interested in, you know, what was it, checking return rates, and what we control is this, what is it, like a more prominent featuring, for example, or text or something. Well, yeah, what we're controlling is actually the presentation of it, let's say. We're not controlling the user behavior.
And we might just find out that people who receive more prompts to send out requests come back not because they've sent the requests, but for more prompts. So
yeah, who knows, possibly. And
so it's an interesting, you could research it, but it's not testable. That's the main thing. It's like there's a difference between something that's useful as a question and something that's actually testable with an experiment.
exactly, and it's very typical to, for example, in the role of a data analyst, for example, you will very often try to find these, you know, relationships that stand out. You could say that, oh, we notice that people who send more requests also return very often. Is it something that we should explore as an idea, etc.? But this doesn't prove any causality, let's say. And A/B tests are effectively trying to prove causality, that we showed this new phrasing, or we positioned this phrasing more prominently, and therefore, as a result of that, the users came back more often.
Yeah, nice.
Yeah, so how about the second? Users who receive an email with suggested new connections to make are more likely to return to LinkedIn the next day.
For me, let's say yes.
Yeah, because
you don't send out emails.
Yeah, but it's exactly what we said. Like maybe some people won't even see this email, right? However, and of course, we will have people in both groups that are, you know, prone to open emails, others who are not, etc. But this variation in people's intrinsic behavior will be equal in testing control. And plus, we can control whether we are actually sending an email to people or not. We cannot control whether they open it.
Would it be
Would we
okay to
want
somehow
to?
like?
I'm sorry.
Oh, go ahead, Robbie.
No, I'm just wondering if if it would make sense to send a placebo email, but it's probably too, I don't know how far you go with making it super
That's a placebo email.
apples to apples. Like, because it says the users who receive an email with suggested new connections. So it's still a question if it's the email or the suggestions itself, if that are.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. If you were not
Yeah.
sending an email before, you can't, but yet then you don't A/B test, you just ship a new feature, right? Somehow. Like for me, do you agree, Tanya? Is it more like before you were sending an email, but now there's a suggested connection, before there was not a suggested connection, and then that's the difference? Because if it was before you
Okay.
don't send
Yep.
an email and now you send an email, then it's more the email has an impact, but you
Yeah,
can't target it on
exactly.
the new connection.
Exactly. So in these contexts and with CRM especially, they, as far as I understand, typically you don't just do send email versus not send email, because of course just sending an email will have some kind of uplift because some people click on it. But this is very short term, etc. So in fact, if you really want to test whether the suggestions inside the email made a difference, ideally you would have three variants. You would have one where you don't send anything, one where you send an email and you have the suggestions, and another one where you send an email but without suggestions. So there you can actually differentiate between the three cases more robustly.
Or I guess if you could measure the fact that the email was read, like if the email has some kind of like tracking in there, you could maybe normalize the results. Or
yeah, but this again would make it, would condition it on users who open their email.
okay, true.
So it's as if we are introducing another factor, whereas the only factor we want to vary between our groups is our intervention. Okay, and then this third one, if a user sends a personalized message with a connection request, they're most likely to get connected, more likely. I said this one would be maybe, because maybe we can actually trick it. So there are situations where we can actually hack it a little bit, where, for example, we could make it mandatory to send a personalized message. And there you remove the user choice of whether they do it or not. Or maybe it could be mandatory with the pre-selected text, for example, with a pre-filled text. So there are ways to trick it, yeah?
But here, I mean, the decision to connect, is it taken from, like, do you consider it's a choice of the user who is sending the request, or from a choice of the user who is accepting the request or declining?
More likely to get, you mean the outcome?
Yeah, so I mean, if what we are measuring,
Yeah, that would be whether the other side actually accepts it or not.
okay, but so in that case, it's not a choice of the other side, right? That personalized message was sent or not.
It is not the choice of the other side. Yes, I mean here, I guess the observation unit is not the single user. I guess it's this the
Like the pair?
request. Yeah,
Okay,
the
yeah,
request is perhaps you could phrase it as a request that contain a text are more likely to be accepted. Or
okay, yeah,
something
so what you
like
mean.
that.
Yeah.
So, in short, it's a complicated topic, but it's very interesting. Another topic is how do I design experiment with small sample sizes? So here I put a lot of charts and stuff, but yeah, maybe I'll just quickly kind of try to explain. So how to understand how we can design experiments for small sample sizes, we should first understand how sample sizes are determined and what they really mean. So in the left side, we see this chart, which is usually used to demonstrate all these different values that we use in A/B tests. So we have the alpha, the significance level, the beta, alpha, etc. So effectively what you see, so you have these two distributions, right? The distribution on the left is a distribution of some kind of value in or variable under our null hypothesis. So for example, let's say it could be the spend, right? So how much people spend in their cart, in their purchase. So this could be assumed to be normally distributed, or at least the averages could be normally distributed. And let's see, yeah, that's it. On the right side, there's another distribution, which is the distribution under H1, which is the alternative, or the alternate hypothesis, which is what we're trying to kind of hypothesize about, that if we change some feature, then the distribution is going to shift to the right. So the average of the distribution is going to be delta higher than the previous one. Now, these distributions have a variance, right? So they're as thick as their variance are, essentially. So the smaller the variance, the more confident we are that the mean is around this value. So, okay, wait, let me tell you a couple more things. So in the lower area, we have this black area here, which is, this is the false positive rate. So effectively what we're saying is that if the null hypothesis is true, so if actually there's no difference between test and control, and we see a value in our data that is above this dotted line here, it represents this percent, so alpha divided by 2. So it's essentially something like there's a 2.5 percentage chance that there's actually no difference, but we see a difference like this. So effectively, there's no true difference between test and control, yet we see an extreme difference between them in the data that we collect. So this is kind of the false positive rate that we try to control for. But when we calculate sample sizes, we also care about this other value, which is the beta and the power, which is 1 minus beta, which is this whole other area of the distribution on the right. So you see beta with the lines, and 1 minus beta is everything else in the right distribution. That means the probability that if there truly is an effect, if there truly is a difference of size delta, what is the probability that we're going to detect it with the number of data that we have, with the variance that we have, etc. So all of this can be condensed into different formulas, but one, for example, on the right, in the case at least of a two-sided t-test, so for normal distributions, we could say that the number of samples that we require is dependent on the variance of the difference of the two samples, of these alphas that we set in the beta, so false positive rate, false negative rate, and the effect size that we care for. This translates to a relationship between all of these different factors and the sample size that we require. So the larger the effect size that we hypothesize, or an MDE, minimum detectable effect size, the larger it is, the more likely it is for us to detect something. So inverse, it is inverse because the higher is the effect size, the smaller the data is that we need. In the case of designing experiments with few samples where we know we have very little traffic, this means that we have to make bigger bets. We can't say that, oh, we're going to look for a 1% increase rate on something very low. This would require a lot of data, a lot of sample, a lot of observations to detect this. On the other hand, we also have the significance threshold. So typically we use this, we say 95% significance or an alpha of 5%. And this is essentially what kind of risk are we willing to accept, that we detect something to be statistically significantly different, but in reality it's not. It's just a result of random variation in our data. So the lower this significance level that we said, so instead of 95%, for example, we could say we accept an 80%, so 20% risk. So we say that we're crudely speaking, but 80% confident that this data didn't come from random variation. And then we have the power and the sensitivity, but usually this is set to a pretty low value, so 80%. So there's not much sense in changing that. But yes, generally the larger the power that we're looking for. So the power is, again, this white area of the right distribution plus the black, which tells us if there is an effect of size delta, what is the probability that we're going to detect it. Usually we go with something like 80%. And perhaps to see it a little bit more visually here, this N1 on the chart on the left, it's also color-coded for ease of reading, is how many samples we need to detect a delta or D here of different sizes. So you see that the closer we are to smaller deltas, the higher, a lot higher, the number of observations is that we need. But if we make bold and large bets, such as this feature is going to increase our whatever conversion by 20%, by 50%, etc., then we require much less data to actually detect this effect. And then again with power, but the difference is not really that big. So really what we can control mostly is the boldness of the changes that we're introducing. So kind of in summary, what we could do is we can increase the hypothesized effect size. This would be I would say, the most reasonable thing to do. We can accept a lower alpha, or actually, yeah, no, a higher alpha it would be. So we can accept a higher probability of false positives. This is wrong here, I should rephrase it. So a lower significance level. So instead of saying 95% significance level, we can accept 90 or 80, for example. Then another thing we could do is to choose a closer conversion event. So oftentimes I've seen experiments being designed in a way like, our first step is to do whatever. You open the app and we're going to look at how you convert to a purchase. Well, there, the starting percent is going to be super low. The baseline is going to be really low. So to detect any increases on top of that will also be pretty difficult. So choosing some smaller events that have a higher baseline conversion rates, for example, did the person go to the next screen? Helps us measure much faster and not require such large sample sizes. And then there's a lot of other more advanced techniques, like you can, for example, do a linear regression instead, or use some other quasi-experimental methods. You can try to do some variance reduction to essentially make these distributions narrower using previously known information. But all of these require quite a lot of work. And then, of course, you can use Bayesian methods. Like everything we're talking about so far is frequentist statistics. Bayesian methods don't believe that there's a true mean, for example, that we're trying to estimate. So everything is a distribution, and there you don't even have these concepts anymore of statistical significance, etc. Okay, I guess we have just 5 minutes left, so maybe I'll go a little bit fast here. So when we analyze data, there's essentially one strong signal that something was wrong in the implementation. And that strong signal is called sample ratio mismatch. Essentially, that is a situation where the percent of users we see in test or control group or in whatever other variant does not correspond to the theoretical percentage that we expect. So let's say we have a splitter that splits users randomly into test and control group. With a probability of 50%, 50-50, yet we actually see that in our data there's a little bias for users to be in the test group. That would be a very, very strong indicator that there's something wrong with the implementation. Why are we having more users in the test group? It's probably because we did something wrong, or we unwillingly or unknowingly introduced some bias in our data. And this is a problem because it implies that no longer is there only one difference between test and control, which should have been whether they received the treatment or not. There's also some other difference. So there's some other behavior that got users to be more in tester control. A typical example I've seen in the past is that on mobile apps, for example, if a user comes in, we need to immediately on app launch, put them into tester control. But sometimes some users don't have good connectivity. So the time to get the response expires. So somebody says, oh, let's just put them in the default value because they're just going to see the default screen, which is the control screen. So let's also say that these users are in control. So you end up with more users in the control group, but also you have all the users who have bad phones or are inaccessible areas in the control group. So you no longer anymore only test on whether, your feature, you're also introducing other differences between test and control. Yeah, this is a well-studied topic in general and very interesting. Yeah, how would you detect it? You would essentially, you could expect for your test to finish and run a one sample test basically to see whether the proportions are actually corresponding to the statistical desired proportion, 50% for example. But that's usually not very useful because you have to wait for the test to finish. Alternatively, you can use some sequential testing approach where instead of just checking every day whether the split is 50-50, which is generally dangerous because there could be a lot of noise and you could get tricked into thinking that there is a difference, but actually there isn't any. You could use some sequential testing approaches, and in Python, there's libraries, for example, that help you with that. I'm going to stop here because we're out of time. Yeah, the last topic that I had was about p-hacking, which I hope all of you are kind of aware of, but maybe just in summary, one sentence is that p-hacking is the idea that you just look through all of your results until you find at least one comparison that is statistically significant, and that's considered a very bad practice. So to counteract that, best practice is to determine very specifically what it is that you're going to test before you start your experiment. So not try to look for results after the fact. And why it's dangerous is because the more comparisons you make, so all of these tests are designed with the idea that you make one comparison. So when we say there's a 5% chance of a false positive, this is for one comparison. So when you have more comparisons, which could be number of metrics you consider, number of splits you make between your users, etc., the probability of detecting at least one false positive increases pretty fast. So you can see if you have like 10 metrics that you're comparing, 40% chance that at least one of them is going to be falsely statistically significant. That's it. Maybe here's my summary.
Super interesting.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Super well done.
It was really great. Any stuff like that you find, any articles and studies, please always post them into the Goodreads channel. That stuff I think is super relevant for all of us.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Sweet. Can I ask a question, or we have to?
I'm
wrap
here.
up?
I have time. If people need to go, they can
go. I'm just wondering, like, so assuming everything is implemented correctly, what do we need to watch out for? You know, like not spamming the user or something, or I don't know what to call. If there's a concept for that, but you know, sometimes you go to a website and then it's like, oh, subscribe to the newsletter and turn on notifications, and it's like, I don't know if it's maybe it's not A/B tested, but sometimes I get the idea, you know, oh, there's this site and they've just A/B tested everything and they're like trying to shove something down your throat, and you know, it could be like competing teams, for instance, at a big company that are pushing different features or things like that.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. When I used to work at Expedia, they would do something like 300 tests per month and present them all. And the big caveat there is that each test is evaluated individually. So you say, this test was successful, let's put it out. This other test was successful, let's put it out. But what is not really tested necessarily is how do all these tests, when you put them together, how do they actually influence the user behavior? So the remedy to that is to do these, either to do follow-up tests where you combine features, for example, but that requires a lot of traffic, time, etc. Or to do meta-analyses over time and try to understand this cumulative gain that you get from different tests.
Cool. Makes sense.
You mentioned some of the implications. Oh, sorry.
No, I was going to say that there are some papers, I think, from Microsoft, especially, they're very hot on this, that show that the cumulative test of putting a lot of positive tests together, the cumulative positive effect is never the sum of the individual positive effect. It's less.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. You had that slide about what like how a small sample size impacts the experiments.
Mm-hmm.
Could you maybe generalize those to like a company like ours where we have like very small sample sizes in general? Do these techniques still apply compared to like LinkedIn where they have so much data that you just make one change and you can see a real big impact? Rather than like, I think you said we should take bigger bets, but are there any other sort of principles that would apply to us? Or would you not recommend this approach for a like company with small sample size?
Yeah, so I would recommend making bigger bets. Also, we haven't really like exhausted our creativity as these companies have, because they go for these very small increases. They bet that conversion is going to increase by 1% because everything is so hyper optimized already that they rarely see any large effect sizes. So in our case, we probably would detect larger effect sizes. So that's one thing for sure. Yeah, if we want to, I guess we could also be a little bit more flexible with this false positive rate. Like this is not a clinical trial where people might die. So we don't really need to be as strict with this 95% significance level. That could be lower.
Interesting.
I guess that could also be a monetary question, because if we're talking about, something about conversion of users into paying, that could be, the risk there could be quite big. So it's also about making this kind of economic decision.
Yeah, because it also seems like the cost for us to run an experiment is much higher than at LinkedIn. Like at LinkedIn, they could try something, and if it doesn't work, they're like, oh, well, that was a good learning experience.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas for us, it's like, a significant percentage of our company's resources.
And I'm a very big fan of Bayesian methods, although I'm not an expert at all. It's much more difficult to understand the logic, but if the company has appetite for that, it's very interesting to explore these ways. And also some of the most popular tools, like even Optimizely, for example, they don't use frequentist tests anymore. They use more Bayesian. And I think Amplitude as well, maybe not in our plan, but they do have some A/B testing feature, and they calculate these probabilities where they say the variant is 95% likely to outperform the control. And that's based on these probabilities that they've estimated, or these distributions that they've estimated. So that's another alternative, but that doesn't give you, I guess all of this, it's not the same as frequentist tests. They're not comparable necessarily.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Then thanks a lot. It was really,
Cool.
really insightful.
All right, I'll share the slides. There's a lot of links.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Tania.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.